Hello everyone. We left off in the last video with the question was Jesus a redeemer or a ransom? And really, how does this affect our understanding of his life and of course his death? Because when we speak about Jesus, we often use words like redeemer and he was a ransom. But do those words mean the same thing? Or do they come from two very different ideas within the scriptures? So the question is, how are we to understand these terms? And the way we understand them may shape how we understand Jesus himself. Now, in order to explore this properly, we need really to step back into the Hebrew scriptures. Why? Because the language of redemption did not begin in the New Testament. It is already deeply rooted in the life, the law, and of course the story of Israel. And within those scriptures, we find two distinct ideas. One is the Redeemer, and the other is ransom. Now, in the book of Ruth, we met an individual called Boaz, a relative, and he is described as a kinsman redeemer. Ruth chapter 3 and verse 12 makes this clear. Yes, it is true that I am a kinsman redeemer, but there is a redeemer nearer than I. In other words, there was a nearer relative. But he did not take up the brother-in-law responsibility as deemed in Deuteronomy 25. So, Boaz stepped in not as a buyer in some sort of marketplace, but as a relative within a family. Ruth chapter 4 and verse 13. So Boaz took Ruth and she became his wife. And when he had relations with her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Boaz, therefore, restored what had been lost. He secured, if you like, the family line. He brought Ruth back into belonging to the family. Now, this was redemption. It was not some sort of transaction, but really a restoration within the family relationship. So to redeem is to bring someone back into their rightful place. Now, in the book of Exodus, we're going to turn to the law, because here we find a different concept. Now, we covered this in a previous episode regarding the owner of an out-of-control ox that kills someone, and both owner and ox were subject to the death penalty. However, in Exodus 21 and verse 30, it states this: if a ransom is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying the full amount demanded of him. Notice, here the focus is somewhat different. A situation exists, the ox kills a person, therefore a penalty is due, and the ox and the owner must suffer death. However, a payment is made, and the result is the release of the owner from the death sentence. And this is not about restoring a relationship. This is about resolving a sort of legal situation. See, a cost is paid, a life is spared, and that's what a ransom is. So we're left with two ways of understanding restoration: redemption as a relationship obligation, and then we have this ransom, some sort of legal repayment. Now, both exist within the scriptures, but they are not the same. The Redeemer, he restores. The ransom is a payment as a substitute in place of. Now, as we move through the scriptures, one theme becomes very clear. Jehovah God himself is described as a Redeemer. Exodus chapter 6 and verse 6, we read, "Therefore tell the Israelites, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the yoke of the Egyptians and deliver you from their bondage. I will redeem you with an outstretched arm and with mighty acts of judgment. Note, redemption is not presented as a payment to someone else. It is an act of deliverance. Jehovah God brings his people out of bondage and restores them. He acts on their behalf. And notice how the language is relational. See, Jehovah is bringing his people back into his family. So, let's come to the words of Jesus now. See, in the Gospel of Mark, we read something which is quite specific. Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Notice how the language of cost is here introduced. But really, we need to ask carefully, how would this have been understood by the hearers? See, through a legal framework of a payment? But a payment to who? Well, it could only be to God himself, couldn't it? So, is the understanding that God is demanding a payment, and that payment would have to be the life of his Son? I mean, is that how the Hebrew Scriptures depict God? A God who demands payment for a release? Or is it through the broader Hebrew understanding of redemption? See, consider this. When we look at the life of Jesus, what do we see? Well, we see him restoring, healing the sick, forgiving sins, bringing people back into the community. Was any payment demanded? Of course not. So does this not reflect the work of a Redeemer? And who do the Scriptures say Jesus was an image of? Well, he was an image of his Father. Therefore, rather than rushing to a conclusion, let's just pause for a moment, because we have two frameworks here, don't we? Redemption as restoration and ransom as a payment. Both really are present in Scripture, but they do not carry the same emphasis. So the question remains, when Jesus speaks of giving his life, which understanding is he drawing from? Perhaps the answer is not found in choosing one word too quickly, but really in recognizing the sort of larger pattern that's before us. Redemption in the Hebrew Scriptures is about bringing people back, restoring what was lost, re-establishing relationships, family relationships. So as we consider the role of Jesus, we're invited to look carefully, not just at the words used, but the meaning behind them. And why? Because the Scriptures themselves give us the framework. And within that framework, redemption is not simply about payment. It is about restoration, about bringing life back where it was lost. And that means it may help us really to understand just a little bit more. Now, we can learn a little bit more about this whole issue from the book of Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 54 and verse 5. We read, "For your husband is your maker, the Lord of hosts is his name, the Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all the earth." So we have just explored two ideas which are found in the Scriptures: redemption as a restoration, and ransom as a payment. And this raises an important question when it comes to Jesus. See, which of these ideas best reflects what we actually see in him? Because the answer may shape how we understand his mission. So, to explore this, we'll need to do two things. First, we will briefly return to the Hebrew foundations. And then we will look carefully at the life and the teachings of Jesus. Not beginning with some sort of interpretation, but beginning really with an observation. See, redemption is relational. Think of Boaz. He acted as a kinsman redeemer. He restored what had been lost. He brought Ruth back into belonging. Redemption here is about restoration. Restoration back into the family. Now, let's consider the point of ransom. Exodus 21 and verses 29 and 30. Verse 29. But if the ox has a habit of goring, and its owner has been warned, yet does not restrain it, and it kills a man or a woman, then the ox must be stoned, and its owner must also be put to death. If payment is demanded of him, instead, he may redeem his life by paying the full amount demanded of him. You notice here the focus is legal. A payment is made by way of compensation. A life is spared. If a ransom is demanded of him, he may redeem his life by paying the full amount demanded of him. So the scriptures themselves give us two frameworks: restoration and payment. Now, what do we see in Jesus? Well, let's turn to his life. And here we begin really not with theory, but with what he actually does. See, Mark chapter 2 and verse 5, where Jesus heals a paralytic. What does he say? Son, your sins are forgiven. See, no payment is described. No transaction is explained. Instead, what do we see? We see restoration. The man is brought back. His condition is changed. His standing is restored. And again and again and again, this pattern appears. We see the sick are healed. The outcast, they welcomed. The broken are restored. Now, this is the work of a redeemer. This is restoration in action, is it not? See, he touches the unclean. He speaks with those on the margins. He restores people back into the community. Now, this is not abstract theology. It actually is the lived reality. People are being brought back. And this reflects the pattern we saw in the Hebrew scriptures. Redemption is restoration. But yet we must also consider this statement in Mark chapter 10 and verse 45. See, the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now, this introduces the language of, cost by way of compensation. So how do we understand it? More importantly, from where did this idea originate? Did it originate in the Hebrew scriptures? Well, yes, but the idea of ransom was by way of compensation for something that was lost. Now, we will cover this thought a lot more closely in another episode, but it'll be in the next series, Series 9, which is coming up very shortly. But for the moment, is this the defining framework, or just one expression within a sort of larger picture? See, because when we step back and look at the life, his whole life, the dominant pattern is what? It's restoration, isn't it? So we're left with this sort of tension. On one hand, we have the language of ransom. On the other, we have the lived reality of redemption, restoration. So perhaps the question is not which word to choose, but which pattern best explains the whole. See, because words can carry meaning, but actions actually reveal purpose, don't they? See, when we observe the life of Jesus, we see something which is very consistent. What does he do? He brings people back into a relationship, back into a community, back into life. Now, this is not primarily the language of some sort of transaction, is it? It is the language of restoration, the language of a redeemer. So the question remains, when Jesus speaks of giving his life, how should we understand it? Through the lens of a payment? Or through the broader pattern of restoration? See, because the Hebrew scriptures give us both ideas, but they do not carry the same weight in every context. So, as we continue this journey, we're invited to look carefully not at individual words, but at the whole picture. Because when we do, we begin to see a pattern emerge, a pattern of restoration, of bringing back, of re-establishing what was lost. And in that light, we may begin to understand more clearly the role of Jesus, not just in what he said, but in what he did. It is gospel observation rather than some sort of theological assertion. See, words versus the pattern. Ransom is just one statement, but restoration is consistent action. So, to answer our original question, was Jesus a Goel or a Kopher? Well, surely it was Goel, Redeemer, like his father. The question is, how do you understand it to be? Now, next we will examine how the idea of a ransom was later developed and why the first Jerusalem Council was convened in the matter of circumcision, and also where a divergence from the Hebrew foundation began to surface. Now, we'll be covering that in the next series, Series 9, when we will begin by closely examining this whole matter of circumcision. So, until then, thank you for watching, and see you next time.